Hi, friends. Welcome again to another episode of Beyond the Clouds, Edge to Edge Transformation. It's always fun to talk to very interesting people. And one of them is Dr. Charles Shi of Needham. Charles, tell us about your journey.
Oh, thank you, Shankar, for having me. Really nice to be here. I used to work in the semiconductor industry. I joined Needham Company 2019. But prior to that, I worked 6 years at Applied Materials. I got a job in Applied Materials. Well, very simple. I came to the US from China, where I did my undergrad at the Tsinghua University and did a PhD in material science engineering. And then as a material science engineering major, very naturally, a lot of the graduates gravitate towards semiconductor manufacturing. Either people find jobs at companies like Intel, Micron in the US, or you end up getting a job at the equipment companies. A lot of them are in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's where I got started. Later, as I went through several different kind of roles at Applied Materials and did an MBA back at UC Berkeley again, I went to Wall Street and became a stock analyst there. And it's been almost 4 years at the Needham Company, and it's been fun.
I was fascinated by what you said in your introductory keynote at the Design Automation Conference last week, where you mentioned that for the first time, the EDA industry's fortunes are now getting decoupled from the fortunes of the big semis. Can you get into that a little bit? What's happening?
Yeah. So what's happening? Very simple. In the past, EDA is the EDA revenues. The market is really driven by the R&D expense, R&D budget of the semiconductor companies, because back then, the one who use semiconductors are not those who design semiconductors. They just buy off the shelf from either IDM companies like Intel or fabless companies like AMD, NVIDIA. But gradually, I think it became more significant in the back half of the 2010s, that the prior decade, that the companies who actually use the silicon feel like they want to design the chips as well. I mean, part of that is really pioneered by Apple. Apple is the one, right? That previously they utilized ASIC companies. Earlier in the 2000s, they used eSilicon as an ASIC service company to help them manufacture the chips for iPods. And then later they use Samsung, right, to use to design the chips that are used for iPhone, etc. But then I think in the middle part of 2015, I think everyone knows they transitioned from Samsung to TSMC. But the other thing is they completely insourced chip design to themselves. And today, if you look at Apple, they are the one who designed the chips, but they are not selling those chips. They just use them. They sell the end electronics. I think a lot other companies followed suit. Tesla made a similar move around the same time, and all the US big tech companies, Amazon, Google, for example, right? And they made and Meta, they made a similar move. So I think really going back to what I mentioned, for the first time, there is a decoupling of the EDA in terms of the revenue, where they come from. They no longer just coming from the semiconductor industry. They come from the broader tech industry that design their own chips. They don't sell those chips, but this is something I think somebody at the DAC I met with came to me after my presentation last year and said, "Hey, Charles, I agree with you. There's a big move from design to sell to design to use. And for EDA, this is great news. You're no longer captive to the semiconductor industry, you are part of the broader tech ecosystem. That's a much bigger market for them.
Very interesting. I also remember a memorable statement, which is chip companies are becoming systems companies, and maybe systems companies are also becoming chip companies. Do you think this is a temporary trend, or is this a long-term change in the way life is going to be in the EDA and in the chip industry?
Well, this has been a trend ongoing for, I would say, for probably a decade if we really start think about how Apple started getting into this chip business. And it's probably an irreversible trend by now. A couple of things. One, chips are becoming important, right? Really becoming important for all the systems companies. It's no longer the case that you can just buy the chip from the merchant semiconductor companies and you just focus on things like software or the overall electronics equipment design and manufacturing. That's no longer the case because Moore's law is slowing down. You actually can see the merchant semiconductor companies like Intel, right? For example, they're slowing down in terms of when they refresh their product offering. And this now there's something called a domain specific computing. Basically, the system companies start to find that they actually can design the chips specifically to their own application. I can guarantee you those chips they design for themselves are going to do a great job for their own application. But if it just you are the other company who buy the same chip from those companies, they're going to do a probably not so great job on the tasks you want them to do. So this is something called a domain-specific computing, right? But at the same time, what that means is system companies, they found that they can actually co-design the hardware and the software altogether. I think in EDA, for the EDA world, there's something called emulator prototyping hardware tools, which allow the system companies to really start designing the software, coding the software at the same time as they start designing the chips. So they start at the same time, they can finish at the same time, rather than they buy the chip and then try to tailor the software to the silicon. So that's a great advantage for them. So I would say this industry went through almost a full circle, right? 40, 50, 60 years ago, those who design chips are those who sell the end electronics. And then later, the specialization across the semiconductor supply chain started, right? That was like 40, 50 years. You first have ASIC business model, right? And then later you got there was an emergence of a fabless model, fabless foundry model, and then gradually even for there is this design services business model, right? That further carve out the semiconductor supply chain into smaller pieces. So every individual company, they specialize in their small piece, but they try to get as much market as possible. For example, TSMC, right? That they specialize in manufacturing. They don't do design. They become a dominant company in manufacturing. But now we're to a point, maybe the trend is reversing. Instead of everyone specializing their tiny little section of the supply chain, they start to vertically integrate back. And now Apple is a very simple example, right? Apple design it, let TSMC manufacture it, and then sell the finished product to consumers, right? So I think similar trend will likely play out as we enter this so-called AI era with companies I just mentioned, right? Google, Microsoft of the world. They design their own chips, outsource to probably TSMC, Samsung, possibly Intel Foundry in the future, and then deploy those chips in their data center. And they don't sell those chips. That's their secret sauce, but they sell the services, right? The cloud services to the end customers. So this is why I call that this is an industry going a full circle, right? From everything vertically integrated, then going to the super horizontal integrated, several parts, a very long supply chain. Now we're going back to this vertical integration. Really back to the point, right? On EDA, this is great news for EDA. I mean, some people think, okay, consolidation probably bad for EDA, but hey, look, if everyone is trying to design their chips to their specific application, what we're going to see in the future about the chip market is you're going to have a lot very high mix in terms of chips, but each of the type of the chip is probably kind of low volume by itself. But high mix of low volume, that's great for EDA because every design, one design is a design just because you're selling 200 million chips per year versus you're using chips for a few hundred Ks per year. Doesn't mean the job of design is any different. It's probably the same. So really going back to the point, I think EDA is in a great position to be the enabler of this transition for the industry, and also will benefit from this trend.